Well, thank you, Dustin, and welcome everybody. I'm sure everybody knows it's Earth Day, and this certainly seems like an appropriate activity for Earth Day. Restoring California's oak woodlands, or being involved in that, certainly is consistent with the overall goals of Earth Day. So looks like we're going to have a great day. I know I see a lot of familiar faces. As Dustin said, I've done this a number of times. I'm not sure how many, but that sounds about right. We were doing it every 2 years for a while, and now it's been every 3 years. So there is some new information for some of you who have been here before. Some things will sound familiar, but hopefully there'll be new take-home messages that we can all share and learn. And I know that there are a lot of restoration professionals in the audience, and so especially when we get out to the field in the afternoon, I hope you can share some of your experiences about what works and what doesn't work. We're really just trying to provide everyone with practical, down-to-earth techniques that make it more successful to get oaks growing and started. There are things in addition to the food, which is back here. I've set up a bunch of kind of demonstrations of various types of seedling and tree protectors, of containers for growing seedlings, of different weed mats for weed control, fertilizer tablets, things. So have a look at those also. And in back there are some, there have been oak woodland conferences about every 5 years, starting in 1979, which was well before I started. I did go to the one in 1986, and I think one of our speakers, I don't think Walt Koenig is here yet, but he has the distinction, I think, of maybe being the only person who's attended every single one. So I know he mentioned that at the last one. Anyway, each of these oak woodland symposia has proceedings that were published by the U.S. Forest Service. There are copies, just display copies back here. There was one in San Rafael, I think in October of 2006, and the proceedings took a long time to get them out, and I was one of the editors, so I can't really point the finger at other people. But it's back here if you want to have a look at it, and I think for 5 of the other ones there are proceedings also. So let's move along. I'm going to do a couple of talks, and the first one is going to be about acorns mainly, and then also about seedling propagation. So just to give you a little background, I started in '86 with a program that Dustin mentioned, the Integrated Hardwood Range Management Program. One of this program is focused on oak woodland conservation and ensuring that oaks and other hardwoods on hardwood rangelands were not being depleted. There was some real concerns at that time that there was, excess firewood harvesting, agriculture conversions, residential development in sensitive oak woodland areas, and so the program kind of focused on conservation. One of the concerns was that oaks weren't naturally regenerating very well. Not all oaks, but some of the species. And so I had actually worked with conifers up in Oregon and kind of gravitated into studying that. So I'm going to talk, and I guess one of the things that when I came here, there was just very little information about oaks. They hadn't been studied extensively, not a commercial species, not a species which was legally protected on the state level. They were kind of considered weeds for a long time, and there were big efforts to kind of remove oaks. So that was one of the concerns. So basically, it was like a blank slate as far as doing research. So we've done some research on acorns and on seedling propagation, and I'll discuss that as well as some other things. So picture of valley oak acorns. Oaks have a very big seed with lots of food in them, stored in the cotyledons, and this is a real advantage in some respects in that they can really grow a lot before they need to develop photosynthetic tissue. And their strategy generally is to put down a very deep root. And this is certainly an essential survival mechanism for them. You can see here on the cups of these acorns, they're kind of warty cups, meaning they're kind of bumpy, and I'm just going to mention why that's important. These are some black oak, Quercus cologii. The first ones were Quercus lobata. And you can see these are actually in a different subgenera of Quercus. And you can see that the acorn cups is sheathed, more like shingles, not warty. And that's kind of a distinctive characteristics of the black oaks versus the white oaks. So in general, the white oaks, the acorn cups are warty, and from pollination fertilization, it only takes 1 year for the acorns to mature, and I think Walt Koenig is going to talk more about that. In the red oak subgenera, they're sheathed, and they take 2 seasons. There are exceptions, but that is the general rule, and it comes to bear when you're trying to figure out what causes good acorn crops or heavy acorn crops, and what may be responsible for poor acorn years, and Walt will be talking about that. Well, here are the flowers of very beautiful interior live oak. We're just a little bit past that stage now, but these are the male flowers. Catkins oaks are, I always forget this, whether it's monoecious or dioecious. I think they're monoecious if they have both the male and female flowers on the same plant, and that's the case with all oaks. And most plants, there are some plants that have male trees and female trees, and then you got to have them both together, or you're not going to get any reproduction. But the male flowers are very conspicuous, very beautiful, very prolific, and sometimes, and if you suffer from hay fever, probably unbelievably nasty in terms of the amount of pollen that they produce. And then the pollen has to find a receptive female flower, and that is very much less conspicuous and very small, hard to get pictures of it even. Okay, acorns certainly have historical importance for Native Americans. It was a primary food source for Native cultures, certainly in California. Not all places, but in most parts, I'd say, of North America. I've heard figures that for each tribal member, they'd gather 1,000 pounds of acorns every year. So they would store them in these big baskets, granaries, and they would use them. They would grind them up generally into flour, and then they could make bread or acorn mush or other soups and things like that. So the acorns were really a feature of the Native American culture because they're so important to their diet, but they really were important in their myths and legends and things like that also. Acorns are also tremendously important for a wide range of wildlife. Here are just a few. We have deer at the top, mountain quail, and the bottom wild turkeys and feral pigs. The bottom two are not native to California. Pigs were introduced, I think the first introductions were close to 100 years ago, brought from Texas. They have spread widely, and some people hate them because they can be somewhat difficult for restoration efforts for oaks and others because they have this behavior of rooting in the soil, rototilling it, and can really disturb planting areas and are incredibly difficult to fence out. Wild turkeys, both are important game animals. We have wild turkeys here. Some people don't like them either, especially if they live in communities that restrict any management or harvest, like Wildwood up in Nevada County. Wild turkeys go crazy. I mean, they're all over the place, and there's problems with deciding how to manage them. But we have a program here. I think last weekend and 3 weeks ago we had kids. We have a youth hunting program where kids who are just learning to hunt come out and go out with a guide and try to call in turkeys. And it's usually not that many get them, but they have a very good experience and they're crazy about doing it. So that's a benefit. Just a picture with a tree with lots of acorns that I mentioned. Walt is Rive now. I mentioned that he's going to be talking more about the factors that are involved in what makes good acorn production and what makes bad. Well, just to mention a few things. Again, this is a black oak. You can see the sheathed cup, and that's an acorn weevil, a filbert weevil, I guess they're called. But and a lot of times people think that hole is where the insect has gone in. It's actually where it's come out. The adults, which look like that, I'm not sure if that's the filbert weevil or not, but they lay the eggs either on the surface of the acorn or poke a hole. The egg hatches, grows into a larvae, which feeds in the acorn. It's a great deal for the weevil. And then when they get ready to emerge, they bore a hole out, and then they fall down in the soil and pupate and become an adult and start the whole thing over. This is a problem for the quality of acorns. I haven't found it a serious problem because generally, if you only have 1 or 2 larvae in there, they don't seem to destroy enough of the acorn to make it non-viable. Generally, the eggs are laid at the top, kind of right underneath the cup. You can kind of sort of where that hole is, and they generally feed up in that area. So if you cut an acorn open, you can see some frass and some areas that's discolored and no longer fleshy and meaty. But it's the really important part for the acorn is right here at the tip. That's where the embryo is, and that's where the epicotyl and hypocotyl, or the new shoot and the new root, emerge. So as long as this part of the acorn is not damaged, and as long as there's still a lot of cotyledons left to provide that initial nutrition, generally the acorns will germinate. Okay, here are some acorns that have fallen to the ground. Acorns, I guess the time they fall here is usually starting about mid-September to mid-November, and in mid-September especially we can have very hot, dry conditions. We had the 49er fire, I think, started on September 13th about 20 years ago, and it was like 90 degrees and 13% relative humidity and high winds. I say that just because those are very drying conditions, and acorns are subject to adverse impacts from drying. We did a study where we put acorns in trays. We collected them all at the same time, and some of them we left out I'll do this one. This group, say we put in the refrigerator right away. This group we left on a bench, just in a laboratory, not in very hot, dry conditions, for 8 days. And we actually did it by moisture content. This lost 10%, 15, 20, 25%, I think. It'll show on the next slide, just to get an idea of what kind of impact the drying of acorns had. And you can see it has a tremendous impact. If they didn't lose any moisture or put right in the refrigerator, 90% germination. They lost 10%, which, as I say, 8 days in a room of 70-degree temperature and no wind blowing seems pretty moderate. But even that had the germination rate almost went down by half. And when you get out into here where they were on a bench for 20, 30 days, none germinated. So the take-home message is, if those acorns have fallen to the ground, you better be collecting them fairly quickly, unless they're in a very moist. I mean, if they fall down into a lawn, which is very protected and irrigated even, that won't be a problem. But they fall on asphalt or on a dry, some dry place where they're exposed to direct sunlight especially, they're going to definitely dry out and be a problem. Consequently, we generally recommend, if possible, you collect them directly from the branches. This can be a bit more time consuming than if you want a lot of them and you can just rake them up under the tree, but generally when they're ripe is when you can twist them and they come out easily from the acorn cup. We do this on a large scale. We used to work with CDF, which is now CAL FIRE. They had a nursery up in Magalia. They still have a nursery up in Magalia where we produced a lot of oak seedlings with them, and we'd go out in the spring. We'd go out in the fall, September, October, and collect them. And here you can see we put tarps under trees that were heavily laden, and then we'd knock the branches with long poles, and then we could pick them up easily. If you do collect them directly from the ground and you're not sure about their quality, there is something called a float test, which greatly helps discriminate between the good, viable, healthy acorns and the ones that are less likely to germinate and might be damaged. The floaters are the bad ones, and basically sometimes these will have a weevil or a filbert weevil or filbert worm will get in there and really eat a lot of the meaty, and there'll be a hole, so there'll be air inside. It'll float. Some kind of prematurely abort and they will float because they haven't fully developed. And if they've dried out, you got that fleshy part of the acorn inside, kind of a hard seed coat, and if it dries up it sort of shrivels and there's an air pocket, and those also will float. So these are the sinkers, are the good ones. I mentioned the difference between red oaks and white oaks. White oaks don't have embryo dormancy, which means they're ready to go. They don't need any stratification, which is a period of cold, moist conditions. And lots of plants that grow in temperate zones do require stratification. I know when I worked with Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, they always required stratification, which meant you had to soak them, get them fully hydrated, and then put them in a refrigerator for a couple of months. You don't need to do that with white oaks. Black oaks theoretically require stratification, and it does help make the germination more even and uniform, but I have found that they will still germinate without being stratified. And just the main white oaks that I'm going to be talking about are blue oak, which is very common in this area, valley oak, which we also have quite a few of, but it's more common in kind of deep alluvial soil and growing in riparian areas where there's plenty of moisture. Engelmann oak's another white oak. I think Dumosa, which is scrub oak, is also a white oak. The black oaks would be California black oak, Quercus collagii, Coast live oak is a black oak. Those are the main ones that we're going to be discussing here. Okay. So these are acorns that are germinating. We've done studies looking at germination because, as I mentioned, there wasn't much, and you can see the little radicles point up, and that doesn't seem to be a problem for these kind of trials. You can see this treatment, whatever it was, these guys germinated much more rapidly than these. These have probably had real rapid germination because after they germinated, we removed them to facilitate the assessment. But the white oaks are pretty much ready to go right from the get-go. So we did a trial to find out when we could collect acorns. Can you collect them all on September 1st? And we went out every 2 weeks and collected 100 acorns or something from the same trees to try to eliminate the genetic impact. And this was for blue oak. We collected over a 2-month period. And then we soaked them or we dried them. I told you the results of the drying study. Soaking didn't have much effect on them. The earlier acorns were collected, the earlier they tended to germinate. But the important part is the first bullet there. We found there was a pretty wide interval, about a 2-month interval, where you could collect acorns and they would still be good quality. A little bit different. There have been a lot of research on oaks in the eastern U.S. because northern red oak and some other species are very important commercial species. And there it seems like the window is narrower for whatever reason. I really don't know why that is. When you do collect acorns, generally, since keeping them, not allowing them to dry out is important, we put them in plastic storage bags and then put them in a refrigerator. We used to, this is like a Ziploc. Generally, I'd like to seal this most of the way, but not the whole way, because you do get some condensation, some moisture building up, and if it's just open a little bit, that moisture will go out, and you don't get the harmful molds building up quite as much. If we collect them and put them in the refrigerator, we've had very good luck with the overall viability. Some people I think Ted Adams used to use Captan or a fungicide to kind of eliminate harmful microorganisms that will grow in these bags sometimes, and I'm sure, I know I have some acorns that have been in there a little too long and they do get this black soot-like stuff, and they can get kind of disgusting. But you want to plant them fairly early, and I think I have another picture. These are some acorns that have germinated. They were put in a refrigerator, probably, I'll just say, I'm not positive, but I'd say collected in early October, and this picture might have been taken in mid-November. So after 6 weeks in the refrigerator, cold, 32, 38 degrees, they start germinating. They're raring to go, and it's important in the field because I think their strategy is they want to send out a root that gets down deep before things start getting dry like they are today. And so they will start germinating even under very winter-like conditions. This does become problematic because a lot of times these roots will get tangled and long, and they'll get, and it's a little hard to plant them if they've got a long radicle. So we've done a study, I'm not sure if that's coming up right now, this is actually another study. We did a study looking at sowing date. You'll see this project when we go to the field, though the trees are about 20 feet tall now and they just have been been abandoned. But we planted acorns every month for a 5-month interval, both blue and valley oaks. And for the blue oak, this is the emergence data. In emergence, I would go out and I would every week or twice a week and get down on my hands and knees and see when the first little shoots started emerging. And just the important thing is here, the earlier we sowed them in November, the earlier they started germinating. The later we sowed them in March, the later they started germinating. And here the survival really went down because they were getting too late a start. Things got harsh, things got dry, these didn't survive as well and they didn't grow as well. So again, the take-home message here is that if you're going to have direct sow your seedlings in the field rather than growing seedlings, you want to be planting them early. And I'd say, November, December is best, because that way they really get a head start and get well established before things become too dry. We've also done some studies on the size of acorns and whether this has an effect. This were from a tree that had predominantly large acorns and a tree that had predominantly small acorns. We did both a field planting and a box planting. And the box planting, these are sleeves that are about 2 inches wide. We pre-germinated the acorns. These went down about 3 feet. And we just let these outside, and it was interesting. We had a bad freeze that year, and I was kind of worried because I think it got down to about 23 degrees, and these were sitting outside. It didn't seem to have much effect. This is what they look like. I can't quite read that. Date, 5/2, 2nd of May. So in 10 days, we planted those acorns in the boxes, just let them sit outside. This is what their roots look like. There's a meter stick, almost 3 feet long, these roots, and the tops were about 3 inches. So you can see that is the strategy they have. Send down a deep root, and often people ask about whether or not, I'm going to talk about growing seedlings in a minute, and I just want you to note that some of these don't have a predominant taproot as much as you would think. Even in a sieved soil where we eliminated all the rocks, we still, sometimes these taproots end up branching and dividing, and it's important in terms of producing seedlings artificially. Okay, so the results of the acorn trial, we did find that large acorns had larger average root biomass. In the field, larger acorns had greater emergence survival in first and second year's height growth, so they do seem to have an advantage, and the medium ones were intermediate. But I am reluctant to say, well, only plant large acorns. That could be maybe if you could easily discriminate, but I would still plant some small acorns because they may have some adaptive traits that you don't want to eliminate. I mean, sometimes we get into problems by doing things that seem like a good idea. If we only planted large acorns, we might run into some problems. So you can take that for what you will. I showed you a picture, I think, of I thought I had it in here, of the fact that these acorns germinate in storage, and this created a problem for us because we'd go to plant the things in December and there'll be a tangled mass of these new roots, these radicles. And so we did a study where we took a bunch and we pre-germinated them so they all had like inch-long radicles. Some of them we trimmed back to 1 centimeter, and we might have been cutting 1 inch of the radicle off. Some we just cut 3 millimeters, just a little bit off the tip, to see if the tip was really important, and some we didn't do anything with. And the results, and here you can see them. This was some of them. I guess these were cut back to 1 centimeter, and you can kind of see that. These were longer, and they just had a little bit cut off the tip, and then there were controls that we didn't do anything. What are the results? Well, doesn't make any difference. So this is good. If you do have acorns that have got these unruly radicals, you can cut them back. I'd just say, cut them back to 1 centimeter. They're easy to plant that way, and it doesn't seem to adversely affect this is seedling height. There are these, I should go back and look at these because they're still out in the field, but that was just kind of something interesting. And I have been told that you don't want to cut them back all the way to the acorn, though, because on the east, we've tried that actually, and then they don't germinate because somehow the root will come up, but the shoot will never come out. If you cut it totally off, then there's some kind of the primordia, or the initializing part of the shoot. If you cut it off all the way back, you do run into problems. Okay, let's talk for the next 15 minutes about oak seedling propagation. There are two ways to grow oak seedlings. You can grow them in containers or you can grow them in bare root nurseries. These practices are tried and true for oaks on the East Coast where, as I mentioned, oaks are very important commercial, so they literally plant and grow millions of them in nurseries back there. So we've used some of their experience in designing some research. I did a study where we looked at different sizes of containers. We've looked at different shapes of containers. We've looked a little bit about how long to grow them. Some of this stuff hasn't been published, but basically this is the Chico Tree Improvement Center operated by the Forest Service. And in one study, we looked at different container sizes. This is called a tree pot. I should have put some of these out, but I didn't. This is about 4 inches by 4 inches by 14 inches. Seems like a good configuration for growing oaks. There are things over here like ray leach tubes. They're usually an inch or an inch and a half, I guess, in diameter and about 8 inches deep. Probably this has 10 times the root volume of this. We found we could grow healthy oaks in either size, as long as you didn't leave them in too long. And leaving them in too long, even in this size, is probably, 1 year is good. 2 years your precedent with something like this. You saw that massive root. If you leave them in too long, they can become pot bound. This is another type of container we've experimented with. This is about 2 inches by 2 inches, I think 8 or 10 inches deep. There are some over here on the table. The only problem is getting these really square so they fit right. So these are a little, I don't know, and it's not a trapezoid, it's whatever, it's a four-sided thing that isn't square. But you try to get them square, and then you put soil in them. And the interesting thing about these is these don't have a bottom. So if you just put the soil in, it's all going to fall out. But if you put them over some screen or single sheet of newspaper, the soil doesn't fall out. And then the newspaper rots away, or the screen has air coming through. When this grows down, the root grows down to the bottom, which is going to be before this even emerges, they air prune. They can't grow in air, it's dry, the roots die, and so they develop a multi-branching root system. So we've found that these types of things work very well, and we've even grown these, sown them in October, November, grow them till March, maybe till now. They're kind of fleshy and they're not as hardened off, but then planting them in the spring, and as long as you water them initially, they do quite well, and that reduces the time in a greenhouse greatly, which converts to, saving of money. If you only have them in the greenhouse for 4 months, then a whole year, it's not going to cost you near as much to produce them. These are for different stock types. We've looked at directly sowing acorns, and this is in the field. This is first year seedling diameter. We had acorns, 4-month-old seedlings like the one I just showed you, or 1.0 container seedlings, and interestingly, these did better. So growing them for a year in the container didn't really provide an advantage, it seemed to provide a disadvantage. So we've had good luck with these, but there is a caveat in that if you're planting those tender, fleshy young plants, you generally do need to tend them a little bit right after you outplant them. It would be hard to plant them on a day like today and walk away, because it's windy, the soil's pretty dry, they may not do very well, but if you watered them in well, I think they would probably survive fine. Okay, this is a sign for the Magalia nursery operated by California Department of Forestry, or CAL FIRE. These are their main crop. They grow a lot of ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, I think incense cedar, even some sequoia dendron, or the mountain sequoia. These are oaks. These, I think, are 2-year-old oaks, valley oaks, and you can see you can grow a good crop of oaks. And these are sown at quite a bit less density, about 10 per square foot, and they didn't have the machinery to do it, so we did it by hand for our experiments. This is a critical step in growing these things. This is an undercutting machine. It's a tractor that goes over the rows. It drags a blade under the soil that severs the root about 10 inches down. And the reason we need to do this, you saw those 3-foot roots, you know. If you grew them in a nursery and you produced them with 3-foot long roots, it's going to be incredibly difficult to lift those out of the soil, and it's even more difficult to plant them. I mean, can you imagine giving a planting crew instructions saying, I want you to, you know, auger holes that are 2 inches around and 3 feet deep, and then put that seedling in and make sure it's not J-rooted, and just, you couldn't do it. You can't plant seedlings with 3-foot roots operationally, and I'm not sure it would be that good a quality. What happens when you undercut them, after about, I think this is maybe 3 or 4 weeks later, you can see that the root at the point of being cut develops these multiple tap roots, more fibrous roots develop. We found that 2 undercuttings was best. This would have been one in May, and then you come along and do another one a little bit deeper in, I think it was August, and then we lifted them in the fall, and we had good quality plants. They're kind of as you're coming in on the right, they're probably trees that are 20 feet tall that we did this maybe 18, 19 years ago. Okay, propagation conclusions. For container production, tall and narrow containers seem to be better than short and wide ones, so the typical 1-gallon pot does not seem to be a very good pot for growing oaks. Typically, the oaks will grow down and then they'll circle around. It doesn't air prune them. There are things you can do with containers. There are copper compounds you can paint on the inside that are toxic to the roots, and when they hit those, it doesn't kill the plant, but it does kill the root tip, and then they develop a fibrous root system. That certainly helps. But generally, a 1-gallon container, even going into the second year, they're going to become kind of pot bound. They get too many roots, and those of you who are involved in planting know that if that happens, you got to, do some kind of significant hacking away at that circled root so you don't put it in the ground. Because what they've found is that those problems with root circling or J-rooting, which is when you plant a seedling with a 10-inch root in an 8-inch hole. Not good. The bottom 2 inches circle up, and they've found, and this was a problem in conifer forestry, 20 years later, some of the problems, you'd have a bunch of these trees blow over because they get into a bad structure, and that root never develops the way it normally should, and if you have saturated soils and high winds, they can actually blow over. So that certainly can happen to oaks. Typically, the big producers like in Capistrano Tree of Life Nursery, they typically will plant them in flats, and then they'll move them up to liners, and then they'll move them up to maybe a tree pot, and then they produce all kinds of sizes. Finally, maybe move them into a 5-gallon or something like that. But every time they move them, and there may be some root pruning that goes on when they do that. Okay, air pruning helps produce fibrous root systems, and again, people are concerned that if you have a fibrous root system, you don't have a taproot. And if you don't have a taproot, then maybe that thing does not get down deep enough. We haven't specifically studied that, though I guess we could go back and look at the results from that root pruning trial. I mean, we studied it in a short term. We haven't studied it in a long term. But my observations of both growing seedlings and digging up natural seedlings is that typical taproot, that carrot-like root, often doesn't last that long anyway. The root will grow down and it'll hit a rock and it'll split. Or maybe some nematodes chew on it and it'll split. Or there's some other physical damage to it. So I really don't think, the taproot does, I think the idea of the taproot is that the root really is trying to go down, and if it gets cut and sends down 2 or 3 instead of 1, I don't think it puts it at a disadvantage, and it may even put it in an advantage in some situations, because the more small roots, fine roots you have, the more you are able to extract moisture from the soil, and a fibrous root system is very efficient at doing that. Okay, for the bare root production, we generally sow them about 10 per square square foot. If you sow them a little, 8 per square foot, you probably get bigger seedlings. If you went to 20 per square foot, you probably get small seedlings, but then they might not meet your standards for caliper and the size of the root. Undercutting roots in a bare root nursery is essential. Just you can't develop those real long ones. And seedlings, we also, in one of those studies, we looked at cold storage for 2 months because that was so important with conifer production, because we'd go to nurseries that grow 10 million seedlings a year, and you can't lift them all the same day and then plant them all the same day. So they have, for a 3-month period, they're lifting seedlings, grading them, putting them in boxes, putting them in cold storage, and whether physiologically how the seedlings respond to cold storage is certainly important. We found that oaks could be stored for up to 2 months without any degradation in quality. The one kind of caveat here is that if you lifted them in January and then stored them for 2 months, that's not good, mainly because you're planting them so late. So it's not the storage that gets them, it's the being outplanted at a time of year when things are very harsh. Now, this all changes if seedlings are being pampered and they're in an irrigated environment. So I'm talking more about wildland plantings. I think that's the last slide. Got 5 minutes for questions if anybody has them. Yes?
That taproot, does it disappear? Have you found it in mature oaks?
Well, mostly and not a lot of people have excavated mature oaks because it's a hard job. We have done a little of that here up to big old trees. Caroline Bledsoe and some students at UC Davis did some. Generally, the soil is the limiting factor. I mean, here we have about 3 feet of soil, and then you get into hardpan. And once the roots reach that hardpan, their morphology really changes. You do see you'll see a main buttress root often going down about 3 feet, but then it splits, and often then you'll get a couple other buttress roots coming out from the main trunk. So it doesn't, down in the valley where walnuts grow, I really haven't excavated them down there. You probably get things going a little deeper because, the soil is so much deeper. Interestingly, there were some studies long before I started by a guy called Berge, and he supposedly found that oak roots, some of them went down 80 feet. And that they'd go down through fractures in rocks, and, I've been in places where the roots look like a snake that's been run over by a semi. I mean, they're squashed and flat, and they go through a little crevice. So I think the tendency is to go deep, but I think the taproot often doesn't continue that way. Yes?
This is just, piece of information about that. I live across the street from the Med Center in Sacramento.
Yes.
And they did some developing there, and they pulled up a couple of oaks.
Yeah.
And they boxed the root system for a period of time. I couldn't tell you how long.
Yeah.
They were able to chunk down into the soil and grab this whole tree and put it into a box
for transplanting some other place. Yeah.
Well, they put it back into the same spot.
Yeah.
They just needed to get the roots up for a while. So,
Yeah.
they were able to put it into this. It was a pretty enormous box.
Yeah.
It wasn't 80 feet deep.
Yeah. Well, they didn't get all the roots. I mean, you're going to find a lot of roots down deeper, but there is, and we can talk about maybe in the field moving trees and whether or not that's a good idea. At the Hearst Castle, Randolph Hearst moved some large oaks to what's the place called? The Hearst Castle? Maybe that's... Yeah. Anyway, they successfully, Julia Morgan was the architect, and they did move some, but I think they're all dead now, and that was less than 100 years ago. So it can be problematic. One here and then over here. Yeah?
Can you long-term store acorns, freeze them?
Good question. No. They're a recalcitrant seed, which means they can't be frozen or they can't be dehydrated. For ponderosa pine, when you got a bumper crop of cones, you collect the seed, you can dry them down to 8 or 9% moisture content, you can put them in sub-zero storage, and you can take them out 10 years later and plant them. Can't do that with oaks, especially white oaks. You may be able to store some black oaks a year, but white oaks you cannot store more than a few months, and you can't reduce their moisture and you can't freeze them. So they're much more, and that creates some problems. You know, if you say, well, I want to go out and plant 100 acres next year and we got everything set up, and then it's a bad acorn year and you can't find anything to plant. So it is a problem. Yes?
I come from an area where we have interior live oak.
Yes.
A little bit higher elevation than the blue oak area. And I was wondering, have you done studies with interior live oak and with Canadian live oak?
Yeah. The interior live oak is another black oak that I didn't mention, and it does have sheathed acorns. We haven't done as much. I've done a little bit, but see, I mentioned that there's a problem with oak regeneration, and the primary species up here are valley oak and blue oak that are having problems regenerating. Interior live oak isn't so much, but we have done some, and they seem to grow to beat the band. I planted some we used to have a field station down in Santa Clara. It was a small field station, and it was on unbelievably valuable land right near Winchester House, about 2 blocks away. So the university ended up selling the land, or it helped us for a while, I guess. But we planted some there, and the interior live oaks did phenomenally well. They seemed to be quite vigorous. They would naturally grow faster than blue oaks. Valley oaks also grow very well. So I don't have much to add about that. Okay, 2 more questions. Yes?
You know, the storage in the plastic bags, is there any need to put material in the bags?
Yeah. You know, some people I know have put in like vermiculite to basically absorb the moisture. Yeah, and people have put in sand. You see some reports in the literature from these where people do store them in sand or store them in some inorganic material. I don't think it hurts, but I'm not sure it's necessary. It just seemed like an extra step, and we haven't found it necessary. Okay, one more question. Was there? Yes?
Blue oaks, I guess the question is, if you don't have a good crop that year, how important it is to wait and use the acorns on that property versus going 10 or 100 miles away?
Yeah. Okay, that's an important question. You know, how off-site is off-site? You know, blue oak grows, pretty much from the top of the Central Valley to the bottom of the Central Valley on the transverse ranges and up in the Siskiyous. And we certainly wouldn't want to plant acorns from up there down there or vice versa. How local is local? You know, we don't have good data to back that up. It seems like there's not as much genetic variability as there is for some. There was somebody who did some work with isozymes, and the variability wasn't great. Generally, what we recommend, you want to grow them in you want acorns that come from a similar environment. So I wouldn't be worried about, going to a ridge at about the same elevation 10 miles that way for planting here. Some people are more purists about that. So I can't, scientifically speaking, you want a similar environment. But how similar? For conifers, they have seed zone maps, and they say 50 miles north and south, 500 feet in elevation. Given that we don't have seed zone maps, I'd say that may be a little broad, but that's maybe a good guide. You wouldn't want to exceed that, I would say, for sure. Okay, I think we'll continue so we stay on time. I'm going to go ahead and act as MC for the next couple of talks.